This is a brief discussion of The Triggering Town by Richard Hugo. First up, we have writing off the subject. I always like to give this out at the beginning because, as you can see right up front, he more or less makes a pretty bold opening statement. And I think that at the end of the day, this is probably true of every writing instructor ever. That, like it or not, no matter what they say or do, they're going to try to get you to write like them. I know in my experience, this has been something that has come up because we all tend to want to shape and move writing in the way that we know and understand it. So, as Hugo says, and I put this right up front so that I can make it clear to everyone that I'm trying to help you write like you. And along the way, in the exchange, hopefully you will find that place. We'll talk a little bit about how he approaches this as we go down the page. So he also basically says if you agree with all that, then all us creative writing folks get to keep our job, which is important. Uh, Now, if you note up here, one mark of a beginner is his impulse to push language around to accommodate what he has already conceived to be the truth, or in some cases, what he has already conceived to be the form. Now, one of the big things is that you can't let language push you around. You need to use language, words, and sound to your advantage. This is what writing is all about. What he's really talking about is trying to find the music in language. Now, this applies to both poetry and fiction. You not only want to find the right word to convey whatever meaning, you also want to find the right words to convey a certain sound, a certain rhythm, a certain flow, a certain flavor that will make the language beautiful. That is what makes memorable writing, both a power of the language in both what it says and how it says it. Now, when he goes on here, and let's talk a little bit about this, he talks about the triggering subject, or the triggering town as he later refers to it. Now, what he's talking about here is that often when we sit down to write, we might have an idea, and as he points out here, young poets might find it difficult to free themselves of this sort of attitude of, okay, I'm going to write about, as he uses, autumn rain. And so here we go, and we're writing a line or two or three about autumn rain, and then wow, now I've got to come up with more things about autumn rain, and I wasn't prepared for that. This leads to potentially some bad writing. What he's encouraging, and what I would encourage you to do as well, is through the process of writing, you will discover what it is that you're actually writing about. Let me really veer off into an example of my own, since I can speak about that you have access to in the Creative Writing Handbook. That is a poem of mine from back in the day called Learning to Dance. The actual triggering subject of that poem is an experience that I had that was a real experience. But what happens after that is a veering off from the real experience to really dig into not truth with a little t, because I didn't adhere to the facts of the actual circumstances of the story, but truth with a big T, which is what is the nature of a relationship between a mother and a son in the face of tragedy. What is it that one understands about oneself in relation to a parent? All of those kind of things that when I really first sat down to write it, the triggering subject was just a way to get to the other stuff, the real subject of that poem. You want to do the same thing. Now, this happens too in fiction as well, where sometimes you may start out a short story and you may get to page 3 or 4, which sometimes gets frustrating. Do not get me wrong. Sometimes you might write 3, 4, 5 pages and realize, wow, I just got to the actual beginning of the story. And yes, you cut those 3, 4, or 5 pages, and that's where you start. Later on, we'll look at some examples from Raymond Carver and how a lot of his writing got cut out of the final version of his short stories. Because, again, when you go into this, there's writing, and let me touch on that in 2 seconds, and then there's revision, and revision is writing. I cannot say that enough. Revision is writing. Now, over here, many folks have focused on this paragraph here. Never worry about the reader, what the reader can understand. When you are writing, glance over your shoulder and you'll find there is no reader, just you and the page. Feel lonely? Good. Assuming you can write clear English sentences, give up all worry about communication. If you want to communicate, use the telephone. Now let me try to clarify what Hugo is actually saying here, because it is an important point that both gives us permission to do certain things, but it does not give us a license to ill, okay? That was a little Beastie Boys reference. When you sit down and write, you will already have your head full of so many voices and so many distractions that you need to avoid as many of those as possible. This is what he talks about later on when we talk about practice making perfect, and ultimately practice making lucky things happen. Luck doesn't happen in that way when you don't work at it. And writing, at the end of the day, is work. And the more you do it, the better you become at it. The more you read, the more you write, the more you think about and process the act and craft of writing, the better you will become at it. When you are writing, it is good if you can get out of your head that you are trying to write to a reader, to some audience that's out there. Now, that's not saying that it's solely for you. Even though writing first and foremost is an act that is you and your expression, later on though, and especially in the process of revision, you do need to be aware that if the writing is to have a life beyond you, it does have to do something for a reader or an editor. Now, this is where I come in as a guy trying to help guide you through this process, is to understand that out in the world, when you send writing out to try to get it published, you are now releasing it to an audience, to someone or ones who will read your writing and determine whether or not it is something that they want to put into print or put online for their readership to read. So you do have to be aware at some point that this sort of writing does have an audience. Again, if that is your choice and what you're wanting to do with your writing. But while you are writing, you will start to have, again, so many different things go through your head that you want to try to make those things become second nature. The list of 14 things, right? The 14 things that are the foundation, I would say, of creative writing, no matter what it is that you are doing. Those things need to start to become second nature for you. You should not necessarily have to think about being concrete rather than abstract or being specific. Those things should start to become second nature. It is very much like learning how to drive a car. If you remember back in the day, when you first started to learn how to drive, You are very aware of your foot on the gas pedal, looking at your rearview mirror, the side mirrors, looking at the road, having your hands at 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock, doing all the different things, checking your blinker, checking over here, making sure that you're looking everywhere at all different moments to make sure that you don't die. But then, now, today, most all of you probably have a cell phone, a hamburger, a drink, you're driving with your elbow or maybe your knee while you're just cruising along, and then you suddenly realize, where am I? Because you have not actually been paying attention to anything that you're doing in relation to driving, because you have now let all of that become second nature, even though you shouldn't, no texting while driving. But you need to be aware that as you continue to do these things more and more and more, it will become second nature. It will become part of you, and then those voices will start to get a little bit better managed in your head. With that said, what he is trying to say here is get in there, get writing, because the more you do it and the more you free yourself up, the better your process is going to become. Now, as he talks about this whole idea of streak of arrogance, and this is a little bit different. You do have to understand a good sense of logic and narrative development, especially when you are crafting fiction, because there is a this to this to this to this, unless you're doing some sort of experimental piece of fiction, and we'll talk more about those kind of things later. But you need to be aware that, yes, when you are in the driver's seat and you are putting things down, you are going to make logical connections. This is something that the readers of the world don't always understand. They think that the writers of the world are playing some sort of mind game or some sort of trick, or doing some really deep and meaningful thing, when really at the end of the day, you as writer are just trying to get some stuff out there. And that's okay. We've all been scarred by our high school, junior high English teachers who told us that this means this and this means this, and you took really good notes, and took a test, or wrote an essay, and repeated all that back, and it was all whatever it was, because you shook your head at some point and went, well, I don't understand. Why is all this black and white imagery in this Herman Melville short story? Did Herman Melville really sit down and try to figure all this black and white imagery out and put it there? Chances are probably not. Herman Melville was just trying to write a good story. But as you move through then, and as he talks about how then to get off the subject, how to move from that initiating subject, he gives us some ideas and some thoughts. You should not feel trapped by the triggering subject. Now, this is one thing that, again, as he starts to go into the whole idea of truth, if you limit yourself to only facts, you're also limiting yourself more into a world of literary nonfiction. This is really using the same techniques, but you're saying that you're telling the truth. In poetry and short stories and novels, you might draw from real experiences, but you are not necessarily trapped by the truth, again with a little t, the facts of the matter. As he says, if something needs to be black for the poem to work out better, make that black, or red, or blue, or green. I remember one particular semester where there was a long debate about whether a Dixie cup should be red or blue in a class. And the debate went back and forth, and finally the determination was it needed to be a red Dixie cup because that's what sounded the best, and so that's the way that it went. You need to think about those things. Again, sometimes you will find difficulty in trying to adhere too much to the facts of the matter, when at the end of the day you can change the truth and make things into what it needs to be. As he says right here, and you'll see the big exclamation point next to this, the post's relation to the triggering subject should never be as strong as, must be weaker than, his relation to his words. The words should not serve the subject should serve the words. This may mean violating the facts. For example, if a poem needs the word black at some point, and the grain elevator is yellow, the grain elevator may have to be black in the poem. You owe reality nothing and the truth about your feelings everything. Now, he talks a lot about words and making a language that is your own. And he talks about owning certain words, words that he will repeat again and again and again. What he's saying there is that you have your own vocabulary. Now, this is also why in this class, when I work with writers, I don't tell them write about this particular thing. Because again, one of the 14 things is that you write to your obsessions. And that is where your strength is going to be. That is where your brain is going to be. And so if I make an assignment, oh, you need to write about your fingernails, you don't care about your fingernails at all, so it's ultimately doomed from the start. That's why the subject is open for you to write to your obsessions, to write what you want to write, to try to figure out the best path and the best way of writing for you. Now, as we discuss each other's writing, this is where it gets a little bit strange and different because, yes, we are saying basically, if I were the writer of this piece of writing, here's what I would do. You, as a writer, take all that input in, and then you decide what is best for the writing for you. Ultimately, our goal is very simple. We want to write something that will affect people, that will be memorable, that will be meaningful. And even though Hugo does say, the meaning will come, if you look at his poetry, you will see that there's a lot of crafting going on. He doesn't just randomly throw some things down. Those pieces have been very carefully crafted. So some of the big things that you need to take with you is to free yourself to write. Do not limit yourself by the triggering subject. Explore the writing as you move along. And then, when you get into the point of revision, you can start to craft the writing to suit whatever purpose it is that you want it to suit. Generally, I teach in the mode that you are going to pursue this to find an audience. So I serve in part as that audience so that you can get a true and good reading of your work from your colleagues, from me, to get that sort of feedback that you may need to see what an audience would do with your writing. Now, let's come on back down a little bit to some of the essay here. As he goes through and sort of breaks down as he talks about this snake poem, as he points out here, in this poem, the triggering subject remains fully in view until late in the poem. So in this case, he has the triggering subject go on for a while until he finally veers off and realizes where it wants to go. And again, sometimes this will happen quickly, it will happen shortly, and you may not necessarily know until the bitter end exactly where your writing is going to go. And that's okay. Now, let's hop over here to the triggering town. You see yet another exclamation point. You hear me make extreme statements like don't communicate and there is no reader. While these statements are meant as said, I presume when I make them that you can communicate and can write clear English sentences. I caution against communication because once language exists only to convey information, it is dying. Now he goes on to explain some of that, and as he does here, you start to get a little bit better idea of what it is that he's trying to say. In journalism, the relationship, as he says down here, between the words to the subject is a strong one. Again, they are there simply to communicate. In the news today, this happened at this location, at this time, and here's more information about it. Our job as creative writers is to disassociate that level of communication so that we're paying more attention to the craft, more attention to the words and the musicality of the language so that we can actually craft good writing. No one necessarily returns to a news article again and again and again because of its beautiful prose. They simply go there for information. Now, as he says, somehow you must switch your allegiance from the triggering subject to the words. And this is where he switches over to using towns. And this is a pretty apt explanation. When you're writing about things that you know, your house, your life, there's an association there that is full of all sorts of complicated, as he says, emotional responses. With a strange town, you assume all knowns are stable, and you owe the details nothing emotionally. But you have to insert that level of connection in there, but again, you're making all of this up. This is why typically when you're sitting down to write, you might borrow certain elements of people that you know to create and craft characters, to create and craft situations, conflicts. In poetry, you may be pulling from real life places that you've actually been, but then you start to shake things up. That's when you start to have a certain level of mastery of being able to manipulate the subject matter of a poem or story from the real life event. This is also why, as I say in other places, when we sit down to do critiques, we do not critique you as a human being. We do not critique the situations as if they are real. We make assumptions that there is a distance, an aesthetic distance, between what is written on the page and who and what you are in real life. So even if there is a first-person narrator in a story, or a poem is told from the first person, there is never the assumption that that speaker is you, the writer. There's always that disconnect. So when we go in to talk about a piece of writing, we would refer to the speaker of the poem, not you as writer, because there is that difference, and that is the assumption that we make, is that there is a distance between those two entities, the speaker and the writer. Now, as he goes through working through his example, and as many have pointed out, he is pretty entertaining. I kind of love the guy. And he really has a fun way of breaking down his examples. Again, a true Hugo move here, that silo, filled with chorus girls and grain. One of the techniques that he uses is to be very specific. He could have said a silo or the silo, but he is grabbing you around the shoulder and pointing and saying that silo. And that's a little Hugo technique that you can take and put in your pocket and carry with you. Now, the one thing that Hugo touches on, let me talk about this very quickly in a more general sense. Many have talked about finding their voice or releasing their voice, and what is that? What does that mean? I'm going to make a quick argument. Your voice is a combination of everything that you have read, where you grew up, who your friends were and who you've been around, your life experiences, and you continue to grow that quote unquote voice as you move along. Now, uh, a thesaurus can be your best friend or your worst enemy. You have to take ownership of certain words. I remember there was a moment back there where Professor uh, just randomly said to me as he walked by me outside of a building, "We're in a quagmire, Joey, a quagmire." I had no idea what the word quagmire meant at that moment, so I had to run in and look it up. That, at that time, was not a word that I would have ever used in writing because I didn't own that word. Years later, I might use it. I don't know if it's still necessarily something that might sneak its way into my vocabulary, but all that is to say that there are words that you can start to take possession of. Uh, as he continues to point out Hugo here, as he kind of explains and talks about the sound, he likes the L sounds of silo, filled, girls, tall, the repetition of some of the N sounds. Uh, you have to find a language that is your own. And once you do, you can continue to expand on that. Uh, now, very quickly, because I think that this can create a little bit of confusion, he talks about two kinds of poets, public and private. Now, I want to make a clear distinction there that he's not talking about uh, the subject matter or this sort of idea of an inside joke. What he's talking about again is that relationship to the language. Uh, there are certain words that we might have a special connection to and that we may use. Uh, and it doesn't mean that we're making up words or that it would create confusion for anyone. What it means simply is that, as he explains, one writer, hey, this word means the same to him as it does to you. This other writer may have a certain level of connection to words, and thus, as he says, certain words that he may use again and again, stone or gray, uh, are things that have a special connection for him. Now, let's come on down just a little bit. Um, this leads us down to, as he told right here at the end, basically, uh, the Jack Nicholas story, which uh, I think is pretty powerful and important. Yeah, that's pretty lucky. Nicholas is supposed to have replied right, but I noticed the more I practice, the luckier I get. If you write often, perhaps every day, you will stay in shape and will be better able to receive those good poems, which are finally a matter of luck, and get them down. Lucky accidents seldom happen to writers who don't work. You will find that you may rewrite and rewrite a poem and it never seems quite right. Then a much better poem may come rather fast and you wonder why you bothered with all the work on that earlier poem. Actually, the hard work you do on one poem is put in on all poems. The hard work on the first poem is responsible for the sudden ease of the second. If you just sit around waiting for the easy ones, nothing will come. Get to work. Now, that's something you can put in your back pocket. Um, More often than not, over my journey, I've heard I wait for inspiration. You can't wait for inspiration. You have to find a way to inspire yourself. If some of you are taking this class to make a determination of, do I have the stuff? Do I have what it takes? That is the paragraph right there that you need to really think about for a while. Because writing is work, writing is time, writing is ultimately the greatest thing ever. Who's kidding who? Because look at all the magical and wonderful things that you can do. Uh, but you got to work at it, just like anything else. I sometimes use the example that I would love to be a professional football player, not really, but work with me. But I could not just walk out on a field right now and line up and, go up against a bunch of 350-pound fellows that would, okay, they would crush me and it would be a sad day for me. But if I worked out and I ate right and I was well hydrated and did that for several years, then maybe. So you kind of get the point. Writing is about like professional football. It is doable, but you got to work at it. It is not something you can just stand up and walk out there and do on a whim, because that kind of luck just doesn't happen. Get to work. Now, I hope that this chat kind of clarifies some of the things in this first section of Hugo. I'm glad many of you read and enjoyed what he had to say. I remember the first time that I read Hugo and got the same sort of excitement and giddy feeling. Like, wow, this guy is, letting me out of the cellar. He's saying be free and go forward. Now, you'll see as we go along, there are some other things, and Hugo is just one more thing to take in and internalize. Some of the other things that he says here are incredibly important as well. That those subjects that feel like ought to be written about, you need to be careful of those. I'll give you one quick example as I'm wrapping this up. I was teaching creative writing actually on September 11th, 2001. And in the months following that, everyone felt obligated to write a 9/11 poem or a 9/11 story. And I basically drew the line and said, no, no, no. Because if something ought to be written about, if you feel obligated, it's doomed from the start. Now, all these years later, people might, and some people are actually, writing about those events, in a way that has a level of emotional detachment that you can actually be successful. But at that time, at that moment, there was just no way. There was too much that ought to have been written about for anyone to start out successfully. So, I'm glad you enjoyed Hugo. He is a great person to have on your side. The book is The Triggering Town if you want to get a copy and add it to your shelf. And if you have any other questions or thoughts, let me know.